Okay, let's unpack this. Forget the idea that cybersecurity is only about building taller walls. Imagine instead a security strategy that involves setting clever traps, laying digital breadcrumbs, and creating illusions to mislead attackers. It's a fascinating world, sometimes controversial, known as cybersecurity deception.
It truly represents a fundamental shift. I mean, moving away from just purely passive defense, hoping your walls are high enough,
Right.
to actively influencing an adversary's perception and behavior within your network. It's about turning their own investigative actions against them.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We've gathered a stack of sources for this deep dive. Everything from community discussions on Reddit to in-depth research papers found on our deal legal guides from GIEC and industry analysis from publications like Security Magazine and SANS.
That's quite a mix.
Yeah. Our goal is to distill the most important insights from these diverse perspectives to understand what cyber deception is, how it's evolved, the ingenious techniques being used today, the complex legal and ethical questions it raises, and, well, where this field is headed.
And it's important, right? In an era where attackers are increasingly sophisticated and frankly persistent, understanding deception isn't just academic. It's becoming a critical part of a defender's toolkit.
Absolutely.
Navigating the nuances revealed in these sources is really key to effective modern security.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning then. What is cyber deception, or CYDC, at its core?
At its heart, CYDC is the intentional use of, false information, traps, and illusions within digital systems to gain an advantage over an adversary.
Okay.
It's about creating a fabricated reality that looks genuine, but is actually designed to mislead.
So instead of just trying to block an attacker, you're actively trying to trick them.
To mess with them. Exactly. The primary purpose isn't just passive defense. It's to actively influence the attacker. You want them to make mistakes, reveal their tactics, maybe spend time on fake assets instead of real ones, and ultimately guide them into environments where you can observe and contain them safely away from your crown jewels.
Right. And this idea of tricking attackers, it's not brand new, is it? It has roots in something many people might have heard of: honeypots.
That's right. As sources like Security Magazine and SANS point out, the concept really started with those early honeypots. Initially, they were used more for research and observation.
Research? Like how?
Like setting up a system specifically designed to attract malicious activity and then just watching, learning from it.
Okay, like leaving out a piece of cheese to see what kind of mouse comes to get it, and then watching what it does.
Precisely that. And collecting intelligence on the threats you faced, seeing what tools they used, what vulnerabilities they were targeting.
Gotcha. I saw a great analogy for this kind of non-standard defense on Reddit. One user compared it to a little more like Kevin in Home Alone and a little less like the house security in The Italian Job.
Oh, I love that. That's perfect.
Right. The elaborate, maybe unexpected, sometimes low-tech booby traps versus the super high-tech, but maybe predictable security system.
It perfectly captures the essence, doesn't it? It's about making the attacker trip over cleverly placed, maybe unexpected obstacles, not just encountering increasingly robust locks they might eventually pick anyway. It's about introducing friction and uncertainty for them.
That really helps set the scene. So, okay, it began with those simpler research tools, the classic honeypot. But as the sources make pretty clear, the world of deception has evolved significantly since then.
Oh, it certainly has. Those early honeypots were groundbreaking, absolutely. But they also had notable limitations that really pushed the development of more sophisticated approaches.
Let's dig into those classic honeypots first then.
Yeah.
What were they typically like? What did they do?
A classic honeypot was usually, a single system or maybe a single service designed to look like a tempting target.
Like what?
Perhaps a web server, an SSH server, maybe a database. Critically, though, it contained no real sensitive data and provided no legitimate service to the organization. Its sole function was to be attacked and monitored.
Just a system waiting to be poked, basically.
Exactly. And their early applications, according to Security Magazine and SANS, were mostly focused on understanding that threat landscape. Collecting new malware samples, observing attacker methodologies, gathering threat intel on emerging attack vectors.
The Reddit discussion had some nice specific examples of people using these. They were talking about SSH, honeypots, tools like Teapot and Cowrie.
Yes, those are really common open source tools. They mimic specific services like SSH or Telnet, capture login attempts, the commands attackers run, network interactions. They provide a little window into what attackers are trying to do.
And the community came up with some really creative, almost old school tactics too, right? Like the one described from the Collegiate Cyber Defense competition. CCDC.
That CCDC example is fantastic. A defending team had this brilliant idea, right? They moved their actual SSH service off the standard port 22.
Okay, hid the real door.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then on port 22, where attackers would expect SSH, they instead placed a simple netcat listener. And this listener was configured to just read from div random and spew that output back to anyone who connected.
Pumping div random into their SSH client, what does that actually achieve?
Well, div random on Unix-like systems is just a source of unpredictable, random data. Sending that stream of absolute gibberish back to an attacker's terminal would effectively flood it.
So it just breaks their session.
Makes it unusable, or maybe locks up their client entirely. It's pure chaos and delay for them.
That's definitely a digital booby trap.
Yeah.
Like the Reddit user who called it the evilest thing I've heard.
It is pretty evil in a clever way. It's simple, low resource, yet incredibly frustrating for an attacker. And that same team, they also mentioned using SSH tar pits.
A tar pit. Like getting stuck. Sounds slow.
That's exactly the idea. An SSH tar pit simulates the initial connection or maybe the login phase of an SSH server, but then it intentionally hangs or slows down drastically, like incredibly slowly feeding back characters.
So it never actually gives them a shell.
Right. Instead of giving the attacker a command prompt, it just spins indefinitely or responds incredibly slowly, tying up their connection, their resources, their time.
So the goal there wasn't necessarily deep intelligence gathering, but just to slow them down, maybe frustrate them, confirm they were doing something dodgy on those ports.
Precisely. It's about wasting their time and resources, identifying them as a threat based on the interaction, and potentially triggering an alert that lets defenders block their IP, like that user described doing in the competition scenario, though obviously you have to be super careful doing that in a live environment to avoid blocking legitimate users.
Yeah, makes sense. But while those creative, older tactics were useful in specific contexts like competitions or maybe for niche research, the sources like Security Magazine and SANS, they really highlight the significant limitations of classic, standalone honeypots in real-world enterprise defense.
Yes, that's a key point. A major issue is that professional attackers became much, much better at recognizing them. Well, there are tools and techniques specifically designed to fingerlint systems. They look for subtle giveaways of a honeypot, maybe a lack of typical production system data, specific open ports that are common for honeypots, or unusual configurations that just don't feel lived in.
So the attackers could tell the fake from the real often enough.
Often enough, yes. And then there are the significant logistical challenges. Setting up and maintaining even a few classic honeypots is resource intensive. It takes time.
The Reddit users mentioned this too, didn't they? The cost and complexity.
They did. Hosting one on your home network, for example, is really risky unless you have strict network segmentation, separate VLANs, proper firewalls to contain a breach if the honeypot gets compromised.
Which most home users wouldn't have.
Right. Or you use more expensive cloud hosting like Linode, which one user noted could be like $40 a month just for experimenting. That adds up.
That's a real cost, especially for just playing around or for smaller organizations. And the risk of a compromised honeypot leading to a breach of your actual network, that's a huge concern, surely.
It's paramount. As one user, Lido Pizza Eater, stressed on Reddit, proper network separation is absolutely non-negotiable. You cannot risk that lateral movement. And because of this complexity and cost, security teams could often only deploy a very limited number of these classic honeypot systems.
Which means they weren't very effective for broad detection across a large network, right? You were basically just hoping an attacker would happen to stumble into the one or two honeypots you had deployed.
Exactly. Any value for wide-scale detection was based on that fairly specious hope, as the Security Magazine article puts it so well. To be truly effective for threat detection in a modern, complex environment, deception needs to be more pervasive.
Pervasive.
Yeah. The Security Magazine article argues it needs to be inevitable, undetectable, and inescapable.
Wow. Inevitable, undetectable, inescapable. That sounds like a much more active and integrated approach than just sticking a fake server somewhere on the network.
It absolutely is. This is the core of the shift towards what's now often called true deception technology. The goal is no longer just passive research or hoping for a lucky catch.
So what is the goal now?
It's about making interaction with some form of deception highly probable, almost unavoidable, across your entire environment. Making that deception practically indistinguishable from real assets to the attacker, and ensuring that once they do interact, they are reliably detected and monitored.
Okay, so it's moved from being a specialized research tool on the side to being seen as a fundamental part of an organization's active defense strategy.
Precisely. It's now considered a key layer in a comprehensive security posture working alongside other defenses.
Okay, that brings us neatly to modern deception then. How does this actually work? What are the techniques and frameworks that aim for this inevitable, undetectable, inescapable ideal?
Right, so modern deception goes way beyond deploying just a single fake system. It's about creating an entire deceptive landscape, or maybe weaving deceptive elements throughout your real environment.
Like painting a complex illusion over the real network, almost.
That's a pretty good way to think about it. The RSUFT paper on cyber deception outlines these key dimensions where deception can be applied, sort of across different parts of a digital system.
Dimensions, like different layers of the system.
Yeah, exactly. Applying deceptive tactics at different technical levels. They identify the data dimension. This involves deception based on simulating or characterizing real data. Think like creating fake files, bait files.
Okay.
Then there's the system dimension, which simulates behaviors or attributes of legitimate systems, how they act. The software dimension, mimicking specific application or software behavior. And finally, the network dimension, using deceptive packet sending or simulated network behavior, faking how things talk on the network.
Whoa. So you're not just faking a server anymore, you're potentially faking credentials, documents, running processes, even how network services respond. It sounds much more thorough.
Exactly. The goal is a consistent layered illusion, one that presents traps across multiple vectors an adversary might probe or exploit. And within these dimensions, various specific tactics and mechanisms are deployed, and these are described across the different sources we looked at.
Okay, let's get into the specifics. What are some of the actual tricks used in modern deception?
Well, the RSUFT paper lists some broad tactics first, like mimicking, which is creating convincing replicas of genuine entities. This is where your fake servers or systems fall.
Okay, the basic decoy.
Right. Then there's repackaging, which is modifying the presentation or appearance of digital objects to make them look harmless or different from their true nature. This could potentially help evade signature-based detection, for instance.
Like digital camouflage.
Kind of, yeah. And dazzling, which is about overwhelming or confusing attackers with excessive, often false information or distractions to maybe hide the real assets or just slow them down in a sea of noise.
Okay, mimicking is the core fake asset. Repackaging is camouflage. Dazzling is creating digital noise or confusion.
Got it. Good way to frame them. But drilling down, modern deception relies heavily on more specific mechanisms, like honey tokens. Senaz and RTIF both really highlight these.
Honey tokens. So not full systems then. Smaller things.
Correct. These are fake, non-functional digital artifacts strategically placed within the real environment. Think fake user credentials, decoy files with tempting names, bogus documents, fake database entries, maybe even fake API keys or web links that lead nowhere legitimate.
And the idea is no legitimate user should ever touch these things. They have no real purpose.
Precisely. They have absolutely no valid purpose in normal operations. And here's the key insight, the core benefit. Any interaction with a honey token generates a low-volume, very high-confidence alert.
High confidence because it shouldn't happen.
Exactly. If that fake credential is used, if that fake document named Q4 merger plans confidential.docs is accessed, you know something suspicious is happening. There's no ambiguity. This drastically reduces alert fatigue compared to security teams sifting through millions of logs looking for subtle anomalies.
Yeah, I can see that. It's like getting an instant loud alarm the second someone picks up a fake key you deliberately left lying around.
That's a perfect analogy. It's a huge advantage. It's not searching for known bad patterns like traditional IDS might. It's alerting on any interaction with something that should never, ever be touched.
So it fundamentally shifts the detection paradigm.
It really does. From looking for known evil to alerting on abnormal interaction with a decoy. Another key mechanism is decoys and lures. These are more substantial deceptive resources like fake systems, devices, or even user accounts explicitly placed to attract and divert attackers.
Decoy mailboxes for phishing detection sounds really effective.
And Zess mentions this specifically. If you set up email accounts that aren't used by anyone legitimate, any email received by those accounts is highly suspicious, right? It potentially indicates a phishing attempt targeting your organization or maybe reconnaissance for a targeted attack.
You could make them look important.
Yeah, you can make them more attractive by giving them names that sound like executives or privileged accounts or leaving digital breadcrumbs that point to them.
And SANS also highlights applying this concept to more specialized environments, like deceptive medical devices or industrial control systems. That sounds critical.
It really is, especially for sectors like healthcare or manufacturing. These environments often have devices running on older or proprietary systems that are notoriously difficult to monitor effectively or patch quickly.
So a fake MRI machine on the network.
Or fake SCADA controller, yeah. Placing a decoy like that on the network acts as an early warning system. If attackers scan for or attempt to interact with these decoy systems, you get alerted immediately, and you potentially divert them from your real critical infrastructure while you figure out what's going on.
So you might even have a whole network of these fake critical devices, a whole fake factory floor, digitally speaking.
Yes, the RSIF paper mentions this concept of bait farms deploying multiple fake systems simulating real critical devices like SCADA controllers to absorb attacker activity and buy precious time. It dramatically increases the probability an attacker interacts with the trap before they find a valuable production system.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Are there specific network-level tricks beyond just putting fake systems out there?
Absolutely. Techniques like deceptive signals are used to divert attackers onto false network paths that mimic real routes, messing up their internal reconnaissance and mapping of your network.
Leading them down garden paths, basically.
Pretty much. Network manipulation can also involve dynamically redirecting attacker traffic to quarantine zones or sending back spoofed network responses, making the attacker think they're successfully interacting with a real service or system when they're actually talking to your control delusion.
Keeping them contained while you watch.
Exactly. The RSIF paper references a specific technique called two-face that uses this kind of network manipulation to disrupt botnets by mimicking command and control C2 traffic, essentially confusing the bots.
Wow. This layered approach, with decoys, honey tokens, network tricks, it sounds much, much harder for attackers to bypass than just a single, isolated honeypot.
It absolutely is. And that leads us directly to why these modern techniques are considered so effective, building on that core insight of detecting abnormal behavior rather than just known threats.
Okay, so what are the main benefits?
Well, as highlighted by SANS and the ROI article we looked at, first, there's higher detection accuracy. We talked about this, the low volume, high confidence alerts from interacting with deception combat alert fatigue. It makes it much easier for security analysts to focus on real, verified threats instead of chasing ghosts and logs.
Cuts through the noise. That's huge.
Huge. Second, there's earlier detection. Deception often catches attackers much earlier in the attack lifecycle during reconnaissance, initial probing, or their first attempts at lateral movement inside your network.
Before they get far.
Exactly. The ROI article really stresses that this dramatically reduces attacker dwell time, that critical window between initial compromise and detection.
And reducing dwell time directly reduces the potential damage and the overall cost of a breach, right?
Precisely. Catching them early, before they reach critical assets like sensitive databases or domain controllers, significantly limits the blast radius, as SANS puts it. This is particularly relevant against fast-moving threats like ransomware.
How so?
Well, imagine ransomware lands on a machine and starts encrypting files. If it immediately touches a strategically placed bait file, a fake document designed to be encrypted, you detect it instantly.
Okay.
You can then isolate that infected system before the ransomware spreads across the network and encrypts valuable production data. It turns a potential catastrophe into a contained incident.
That's a really tangible benefit for any organization facing ransomware threats, which is basically everyone now.
It is. Third, you gain incredibly valuable threat intelligence. When attackers interact with your specific deception environment, you learn their methods, their tools, their targets, all relevant to your organization.
Not generic threat feeds, but stuff they're actually trying against you.
Yeah. Exactly. This isn't generic threat intel you buy. It's highly specific and immediately actionable for your network. It helps you tailor your defenses, tune your other security tools, and refine your incident response plans based on real-world attempts against you. The Reddit user's idea of collecting and maybe sharing the IPs and malware hashes they captured is a perfect example of the kind of specific intel you can get.
So you're essentially learning the enemy's playbook on your own turf in a safe way.
Yes, exactly. And fourth, there's prevention and risk reduction. By strategically placing deceptive assets and breadcrumbs throughout your environment, you significantly increase the probability that an attacker engages with deception first, before hitting something real.
You're changing the odds.
You really are. SANS gives a good example. Imagine you have 50 production servers. If you deploy 50 realistic deceptive servers and sprinkle dozens or hundreds of honey tokens and breadcrumbs across your endpoints and directories.
An attacker moving laterally is way more likely to hit a trap.
Far more likely, yes. They're essentially navigating a minefield where most of the ground is rigged. Sands details how breadcrumbs are particularly effective here.
Breadcrumbs, like Hansel and Gretel.
Sort of. These are things like fake credentials cached on endpoints, deceptive entries in Active Directory that seem to point to sensitive systems, but actually lead to decoys, fake configuration files, things like that.
Things an attacker would naturally look for after compromising a machine.
Exactly. An attacker compromising an endpoint will naturally run queries, look for cached credentials, search file shares. By presenting them with fake, tempting options, you actively lead them directly into your monitored decoy environment.
It's like leaving a trail of candy wrappers leading straight to a cage. Clever.
Exactly. It's a very effective way to ensure detection. And these specific techniques, like using decoy mailboxes for phishing detection or bait files for ransomware, directly address specific high-impact threats by enabling that crucial early detection.
Okay, the techniques are clearly powerful and offer some significant advantages over just relying on traditional defenses. But implementing all this sounds like a pretty substantial undertaking. What are the practical considerations? What do you need to think about?
It certainly can be, yes. The Reddit discussions touched on this quite a bit. Setting up and maintaining these environments, especially if you're using open source tools or building highly customized decoys, can be time-consuming and definitely requires significant technical expertise.
And we talked earlier about the absolute necessity of network separation. That seems critical.
And it's absolutely worth stressing again. Proper network separation is non-negotiable. Isolating your deceptive systems and environments completely from your production network using strict firewall rules, dedicated separate VLANs, maybe even physically separate hardware or dedicated cloud environments, it's vital.
Why so critical?
Because if a decoy system is compromised, and you almost have to assume it eventually will be, that's part of its purpose. You must prevent the attacker from using that compromised decoy to pivot or jump into your real valuable assets.
So your trap doesn't accidentally become a launch pad for the attacker into the rest of your network.
Exactly. That containment step is absolutely fundamental to minimizing the risk of using deception. And when organizations are considering implementation, they do have options.
Right, the open source versus commercial solutions question.
Sands discusses this trade-off pretty well. Open source solutions, like some of the tools mentioned on Reddit, often have lower upfront software costs, and they can offer tremendous flexibility and customization if you have the internal expertise, the people power, to deploy, configure, and manage them effectively.
But they can require more hands-on work, more internal effort.
Yes, potentially much higher operational costs in terms of staff time for setup, ongoing maintenance, monitoring, developing the alerts, keeping things updated, and they typically lack formal customer support or defined service level agreements, SLAs. Plus, there's always the risk with open source that the project might become inactive or might not be maintained long term.
So you really need a strong, dedicated internal team if you go that route.
You really do. Commercial solutions, on the other hand, often provide more integrated, easier-to-deploy platforms. They frequently have more automation built in, sophisticated dashboards, and pre-configured decoys.
And vendors offer support.
Oh, yes. Vendors, and some mentioned in the sources include Elusive Networks and Ativo Networks, offer these packaged solutions typically with dedicated customer support, maintenance, and those important SLAs.
Which sounds like less burden on the internal security team, potentially.
Often, yes, in terms of day-to-day management. But they usually have higher initial licensing or subscription costs and potentially less flexibility for highly specialized or unique environments compared to a completely custom open source build.
So it's a trade-off.
It really is. The choice depends heavily on an organization's budget, their existing security infrastructure, the technical capacity and skills of their staff, and their specific deception goals. What are they trying to achieve?
It sounds like figuring out which path to take open source, commercial, maybe a mix, requires some serious research.
Definitely. And for security leaders exploring these options, especially comparing different commercial providers, resources like www.cisomarketplace.com can be incredibly helpful.
How so?
Well, a site like that aims to provide a centralized place to compare features, support models, deployment options, and maybe even get insights into pricing or integrations from various vendors, specifically in the deception technology space. It helps you sort through the marketing and compare capabilities side by side.
That sounds like a great starting point when trying to figure out which type of solution and maybe which specific vendor might be the right fit for your organization's needs and budget.
Definitely worth checking out if you're seriously considering implementing deception. It provides that landscape view. But regardless of the solution chosen, open source or commercial, a really critical point that SANS emphasizes is that deception is primarily a detection tool.
Meaning it's not the end game itself, it's a way to start the incident response process.
Exactly. The value of detecting an attacker interacting with your deception environment is severely limited if you don't have a robust, documented, and hopefully practiced incident handling process ready to act on that alert immediately.
You need a plan.
You absolutely need a plan. What happens the second a honey token is touched? Who gets notified? What are the immediate containment steps? How do you analyze the activity? Without that follow-through, the detection is just noise.
So it absolutely has to be integrated into your existing security operations, your SOC workflows.
Precisely. The ROI article highlights this too, how deception complements and strengthens your existing security investments. Things like your SIM, your IDSIPs, your endpoint detection and response EDR tools.
How does it complement them?
It provides a unique layer of visibility and those high-confidence alerts that traditional signature-based or even anomaly detection methods might completely miss. It helps identify blind spots in your other defenses. Critically, it allows you to move beyond just looking for known malicious activity signatures to identifying any unauthorized interaction with your strategically placed traps as inherently suspect and worthy of investigation.
That shift again from looking for known bad patterns to flagging anything touching the trap as bad, that really seems like the fundamental power behind modern deception technology.
It really is. It provides a significant advantage against sophisticated, adaptive adversaries who are constantly changing our tactics to evade traditional defenses.
Now, as these techniques get more sophisticated, the role of artificial intelligence, AI, naturally comes up. How is AI being used in cyber deception today? Is it already a big factor?
It's starting to be. According to the RCUV paper that focused heavily on AI and ethics in deception, AI is already playing a role, primarily using machine learning ML and deep learning DL.
And where are they using ML and DL?
Mostly for threat detection within the deceptive environments. These AI techniques are well suited for analyzing the logs and telemetry coming off the decoys and honey tokens, identifying subtle patterns of interaction that indicate malicious activity, maybe distinguishing automated scanning from manual exploration.
So AI is helping analyze the data collected by the traps to make the detection smarter.
Exactly, powering the detection engine behind the scenes. The paper also mentions that reinforcement learning, RL, is being explored.
Reinforcement learning, how would that work?
Well, potentially RL could help optimize the deception strategy dynamically. Imagine AI learning from attacker interactions and then deciding in real time which decoys to activate, where to place new breadcrumbs, or how to modify the deceptive environment to be more effective against the specific attacker or campaign being observed.
Wow, that sounds pretty advanced. The RCIV paper also proposes a more comprehensive framework where AI is involved across the entire defense lifecycle, doesn't it? How does that vision play out?
Yeah, they propose a framework where AI could be integrated into essentially all layers of deception operations. In the data layer, AI could help analyze real network traffic to generate more realistic deceptive data and system profiles.
Making the fakes more convincing.
Right. In the defense layer, as we discussed, AI-powered engines analyze monitored data to detect threats. In the decision layer, AI algorithms could potentially automate or at least inform the choices about how to respond to an alert. Should we quarantine the attacker, feed them more disinformation, try to gather more intel? And in the orchestration layer, AI could potentially automate the dynamic deployment, modification, and management of the entire deception environment itself.
That sounds incredibly advanced. AI designing and running the deception campaign almost autonomously.
It's definitely the future vision presented in the research. But the RSIC paper also points out significant opportunities and challenges for AI and CYDES, where there's currently a surprising lack of research or practical use, particularly when it comes to more advanced AI techniques.
Really? Like what areas are being underutilized?
Two big ones they highlight are federated architectures and generative models.
Okay, federated architectures. What's the idea there for deception?
Federated learning involves training machine learning models across multiple decentralized devices or even different organizations without actually centralizing the raw training data.
So everyone contributes to the model without sharing their private data.
Exactly. And the potential benefit for deception is huge. collaborative threat intelligence without sharing sensitive internal logs or decoy interaction data. Organizations could collectively train a shared AI model on the types of interactions observed in their respective deception environments.
So the model gets smarter for everyone.
Right. It improves the model's ability to detect new or evolving attacker tactics for all participants, all while keeping their specific, potentially sensitive, raw operational data private and secure. It's like privacy-preserving collaborative threat intelligence.
That sounds like a really powerful concept, especially for sharing threat insights more safely between organizations.
It really is. And the other big area is generative models. These are the types of AI used to create realistic images, text, code, even music things like GPT or DALL-E.
How could they be used in deception?
Well, the Ersicht paper suggests these generative models hold enormous potential for creating far more realistic deceptive artifacts. Imagine AI generating fake documents that are contextually relevant, simulating complex and believable system behaviors, crafting realistic network traffic patterns, or even generating automated deceptive responses in real time that are highly convincing to human attackers.
Making the illusions much harder to see through, basically indistinguishable.
That's the ultimate goal, increasing the fidelity, the believability, and therefore the effectiveness of the deception significantly. And one other crucial area the paper says needs more development is better leveraging the forensic data collected from deception engagements.
Using what you learn from attackers hitting the traps.
Yes. Using that detailed information about exactly how attackers interacted with the decoys, what commands they ran, what files they looked for, how they tried to escalate privileges to continuously refine and improve both the AI detection models and the deception systems themselves, creating a tight feedback loop that isn't fully utilized in most systems yet.
So, the future of deception could be highly automated, incredibly adaptive, stunningly realistic, and constantly learning from every single engagement.
That's certainly the direction the research suggests it could go, really pushing deception towards that ideal of being undetectable and truly inescapable for adversaries.
Which is fascinating technologically. But as the technology gets this sophisticated, we absolutely have to address the crucial legal and ethical landscape surrounding it.
It's absolutely vital, and frankly, often overlooked until it's too late. As the GIA's primer, which focuses mainly on U.S. laws, highlights, this is often viewed as a complex legal gray area.
Gray area how?
Well, many IT professionals and even general corporate legal teams may lack specific knowledge about the laws governing deception techniques. Hiring specialized legal counsel just for this issue can be expensive, especially for smaller organizations. And crucially, the relevant laws like wiretapping statutes or privacy laws can apply very differently depending on who is deploying the deception.
Meaning what's legal for, say, a government agency might not be legal for a private company or an individual researcher.
Exactly. The rules can vary significantly. And the GIAC source identifies two primary legal concerns that organizations using deception need to be acutely aware of: privacy and entrapment.
Okay, privacy comes up because, by definition, you're capturing and recording everything an attacker does on your deceptive system, right?
Right. The GIAC paper clarifies that this recording activity isn't necessarily the same thing as illegal wiretapping, but it is governed by laws like the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, ECPA, in the U.S. ECPA deals with the interception of electronic communications.
And how does ECPA relate to deception activities?
ECPA uses this model with A and B as the communicating parties, say, the attacker and your honeypot, and X as the interceptor, which is you, the organization running the honeypot. For X to legally intercept communications between A and B, they generally need to rely on specific exceptions written into the ECPA.
What are the key exceptions that apply here?
The two main ones discussed in the source are the provider exception, which basically allows the owner of the communication service or infrastructure, like an ISP or a company running its own network and the honeypot server on it, to monitor communications for the purpose of protecting their service or ensuring quality.
Okay, protecting their own systems.
Right. And the second big one is consent. If the communicating parties agree to the monitoring, then interception is generally permissible.
Consent from an attacker seems unlikely to get explicitly.
It is generally, but in the context of deception, consent is often handled through the use of banners, warning banners.
Like the messages you see when you log into corporate systems.
Exactly. For interactive services like SSH or Telnet, using clear pre-login and maybe post-login banners is the standard method. These banners state explicitly that the system is monitored, that all activity may be recorded, and that continued use of the system constitutes consent to this monitoring.
So you connect, you see the warning, you proceed, you've implicitly agreed.
That's the legal argument, yes. Logging in after seeing that banner is argued as implied consent. However, the GIS paper notes this gets much trickier for non-interactive services, like just browsing a web server or sending an email via SMTP. It's difficult to prove the user actually saw and consented to a banner, say, hidden in a link at the bottom of a web page.
Right, they might never see it.
And for truly unauthorized access, where an attacker bypasses standard entry points entirely, like through an exploit, there's an argument to be made that they may forfeit certain privacy protections, but relying on that is legally risky. It's not always a guaranteed defense.
And ECPA also specifically protects encrypted communications, doesn't it?
Yes, that's a crucial point from the GIX paper. You generally cannot just intercept encrypted traffic and attempt to decrypt it because you think it might contain evidence of wrongdoing. ECPA provides strong protections for encrypted transmissions against interception, even if the encryption is theoretically breakable.
Okay, so documenting everything about setting up those consent banners seems absolutely critical for your legal defense.
Absolutely vital. The GISC paper strongly emphasizes this. You need to document your build scripts with comments showing exactly when and how the banner was installed. Taking full system backups at the time of deployment provides dated, time-stamped evidence that the banners were active.
Proof they were there when the intrusion happened.
Exactly. And they strongly suggest consulting with legal counsel specifically to get the banner wording exactly right.
Yeah, the wording matters legally.
Hugely. The GIAC paper even references the notoriously lengthy Department of Defense login banner as an example of how thoroughly legal teams approach crafting this text, even if it seems overly verbose to users. Getting that banner text legally sound is absolutely a job for experienced legal experts, not IT staff guessing.
Okay, so privacy is a major concern, best managed through careful documentation and legally reviewed banners wherever possible. What about the other big one? Entrapment.
Entrapment is the second major legal concern the GISC paper discusses, but it's really crucial to understand what entrapment actually is in a legal context. It's a legal defense used by an accused person in court. It is not a cause of action, meaning you can't sue someone for entrapment.
Okay, so an attacker caught messing around in your honeypot might try to claim in court that they were entrapped by you.
Correct. They would argue that they wouldn't have committed the crime, the unauthorized access, the data theft, whatever it was, but for the specific influence or inducement by the agent, which in this case would be you, the deception operator.
And is that an easy defense to make?
No, generally not. The legal system usually presumes against entrapment, and it's typically a defense that is quite narrowly defined and hard to prove.
Can you give a simple example, maybe, of what would count as entrapment versus what wouldn't?
Yeah, the GIAC paper uses these illustrative scenarios with Jake and Matt, which are pretty helpful. Jake is a skilled admin, maybe a bit arrogant. An undercover agent repeatedly challenges his hacking abilities, plays on his ego until Jake finally agrees to hack a specific system just to prove he can.
Okay, his pride was pushed.
Right. Now, Matt is another admin. An agent threatens him with serious physical harm unless he hacks a system, and Matt complies purely out of fear for his safety.
Okay, much more direct coercion.
Exactly. Matt has a much stronger entrapment defense because he was clearly compelled by a credible threat. Jake's defense is much weaker because arguably just appealing to his bruised ego was enough. The court would likely find he was already predisposed to commit the crime, and the agent just gave him an opportunity or a slight push. The core legal question often boils down to predisposition. Would the person likely have committed this type of crime anyway without the specific undue influence of the agent?
Okay, predisposition is key. And how does that relate to honeypots and typical cyber deception techniques?
Well, most honeypots and modern deception techniques are designed specifically to attract individuals who are already looking for systems to compromise, who are already predisposed to malicious activity.
They're looking for trouble already.
Exactly. The honeypot or the decoy file or the fake credential just sits there, passively looking vulnerable or tempting. It doesn't actively induce the crime in the legal sense. There's typically no interaction after the attacker connects that actively persuades, pressures, threatens, or recruits them into breaking in or escalating their actions.
So the deception acts as a passive lure, not an active recruiter or coercer.
Precisely. This general lack of active inducement makes it very difficult for an attacker to successfully use entrapment as a defense against a properly configured honeypot or deception operator. However, and this is an important warning from the GISC source, if you actively publicize your honeypot or deception environment.
Like posting about it on hacking forums.
Exactly. If you say, hey, come check out my vulnerable server at this IP address, you significantly increase the likelihood and potential validity of an entrapment defense being raised successfully by an attacker you catch. You've arguably crossed the line from passive attraction to active inducement. So the advice is, keep your deception operations quiet. Don't brag about them.
Silence is key to protecting yourself legally on that front, then.
Very much so. The GIAC paper also briefly touches on other potential legal risks, even for purely research-focused honeypots. For instance, there might be a legal duty to report certain types of illegal content you might inadvertently observe on your honeypot, like the paper's example of discovering child pornography.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And there's also the potential liability issue if your deceptive system is compromised and then used by the attacker as a platform to launch further attacks against other third-party systems.
Which brings us right back full circle to the absolute necessity for robust containment measures.
Absolutely. Containment isn't just good security practice. It's also a critical part of your legal defense strategy. And in fact, containment is one of the 4 key protective measures outlined in the GISC paper's checklist for legal due diligence when deploying any kind of deception technology.
Okay, what are those 4 protective measures? A checklist sounds useful.
It's a great summary. 1, document everything. This is huge. It includes network diagrams showing where the deception fits, documented communications with management, approving the deployment, a full system backup of the deceptive environment at the time of deployment for evidence, copies of the firewall rules and ACLs you put in place for containment, and clear documentation of the intent and purpose of the deception. Why are you doing this?
Documenting intent matters.
Yes, showing it's for defense or research, not malicious purposes. Also, crucially, document the relevant company policies like acceptable use policies, AUPs, or terms of service, TOS, as they existed at the time of deployment, because policies can change over time and you need proof of what was in effect when the incident occurred.
Okay. Document everything. What's 2?
2, add banners. Install those warning and consent banners wherever technically feasible, especially on interactive services like SSH or RDP, and meticulously document that you did this, when, and how.
Got it. 3,
consult AUP terms of service. Before deploying, review your current internal policies. Document that the planned deception activity, monitoring, recording, is consistent with your company's stated rules regarding network use and monitoring. Ensure you're not violating your own policies.
That makes sense. And 4 must be containment.
4 is containment. Implement strong technical controls, primarily robust firewall rules limiting or completely blocking outbound connections from the deceptive environment. The goal is to ensure that if an intruder does compromise the deceptive system, they absolutely cannot use it to pivot, scan, or attack your real internal network or other external systems. Keep them trapped inside the box.
That checklist, document, banner, consult policy, contain that, it sounds like absolutely essential homework before you even consider turning on a single deceptive system.
It really should be considered the minimum standard for demonstrating legal due diligence and mitigating risk when engaging in these activities.
Okay, so we've navigated the complex, sometimes murky legal landscape. But as the Arcos paper on cyber deception ethics points out very clearly, legality isn't the only bar we need to clear. Just because something might be legal doesn't automatically make it ethical.
Precisely. And this is where things can get even more complex, because traditional ethical frameworks often struggle quite a bit with the concept of intentional deception, even when it's used for purely defensive purposes.
How so? Why do traditional ethics find it difficult?
Well, the Arc-Sci paper explores this really well. Take Kantian ethics, for example. This framework is based on strict adherence to universal moral rules or duties, regardless of the consequences. A core Kantian principle is that lying is fundamentally wrong and never permissible.
Never lie, no matter what.
Right. Following that strictly, this framework would likely prohibit the very act of designing deceptive systems, because their entire purpose is to mislead, which Kant would equate with impermissible lying.
Which, as you said earlier, isn't very practical for real-world cybersecurity defense where deception can be highly effective.
No, it makes defense difficult. Then you have utilitarianism. This framework focuses solely on the consequences of actions. The goal is to maximize overall good or happiness and minimize overall harm.
The ends justify the means, basically.
In a sense, yes. Utilitarianism could potentially justify using cyber deception if the overall security benefit preventing a major breach, catching criminals, is deemed to outweigh any negative consequences like misleading the attacker. However, the big criticism here is that it lacks inherent constraints on the methods used to achieve that good outcome. It could potentially lead to ethically questionable or even harmful deceptive tactics being justified solely based on their perceived positive end result.
Right, it doesn't give you clear rules on how you achieve the good outcome.
Exactly. And then there's virtue ethics, which focuses more on the character and intentions of the moral agent, the person acting. Is the designer acting virtuously? It's also quite difficult to apply this directly and consistently to the design of complex technical systems. What are the specific virtues of designing a good honeypot? It's abstract.
So it sounds like we really need an ethical framework that's specifically tailored for this unique area of defensive deception. And this is where the Arcs of Paper proposes something called the Doctrine of Cyber Effect, or DCE.
Yes, exactly. It's an ethics framework specifically designed for defensive cyber deception. It tries to find a workable balance between the legitimate need for effective security and important ethical constraints on how we achieve it. It outlines 5 core principles.
Okay, what are those 5 principles?
The first is goodwill. The designer must act with good intention, specifically aiming for the social good of network security and defense, not for malicious purposes or purely commercial gain without regard for impact.
So, have the right motives.
Right. The second is deontology. Unlike pure utilitarianism, DCE incorporates some rule-based constraints on actions. It emphasizes the importance of avoiding deceptive tricks that might inadvertently mislead or harm innocent, legitimate users.
Don't trap the good guys by mistake.
Exactly. It requires balancing the need for security against respecting these ethical boundaries. For example, this principle might suggest you shouldn't create a fake login page that looks so real that a legitimate but perhaps careless employee might accidentally enter their real credentials into it, even if that same trap would perfectly catch an attacker. You have to consider the potential harm to non-attackers.
Okay, that makes sense. What's next?
Third is no harm. Closely related, this principle states you should actively strive to minimize harm to innocent users, their data, or other systems connected to the network. This ties back to containment too. Don't let your deception cause collateral damage. Fourth is transparency. Wherever feasible and safe, deception policies and the fact that monitoring is occurring should ideally be announced or made known. Promoting overt deception, like clear banners, is ethically preferable to completely covert deception, when possible, though the paper acknowledges covert deception might sometimes be necessary.
Strive for openness where you can.
Yes. And fifth is fairness. This principle asks the designer to consider the legitimate interests of all potential users who might interact with the system, including legitimate users who might be negligent or whose accounts might be compromised or who might be influenced by attackers, as well as illegitimate users, the attackers themselves, and even the designer's own interests. It relates to John Rawls' concept of the veil of ignorance, trying to design the system fairly, almost as if you don't know which role you yourself might end up playing within it.
Wow. Okay, so it's a framework trying to blend good intentions, specific rules about how you can use deception, like not harming innocents or trapping them unfairly, minimizing overall negative impact, striving for openness when practical, and designing the whole system with a sense of fairness for everyone who might encounter it.
That's the essence of it, yes. It attempts to provide practical, actionable, ethical guidance specifically for designers and implementers of defensive deception systems. And the paper also introduces a reasoning framework aligned with these DCE principles, which they call the Game of Ethical Duplicity, GED.
A game theory approach to ethics. That sounds interesting.
It is, in a way. It uses concepts from game theory to model the strategic interactions between the defender, the system designer operator, and various types of users. They might encounter legitimate users in different states, maybe negligent, maybe their account is compromised, maybe they're being subtly influenced by an attacker, and of course, illegitimate users, the actual attackers.
And what's the goal of modeling it like a game?
The goal is to use this model to help design deception policies and technical systems that achieve 2 things simultaneously. First, encourage legitimate users to comply with security policies or interact safely and willingly with the system, and second, effectively deter or trap illegitimate users, all while strictly adhering to the ethical constraints defined by those 5 DCE principles we just discussed.
It sounds like a really sophisticated way to try and think through the complex ethical implications of different design choices before you build the system.
It aims to be, yes. The Arcs of Paper is honest, though. and acknowledges the inherent challenge here. Finding design solutions that satisfy all of these ethical principles perfectly and simultaneously can be incredibly difficult, sometimes perhaps even impossible in practice.
So compromises are needed.
Often, yes. It frequently requires finding complex trade-offs that carefully balance moral considerations, like minimizing harm to potentially negligent users, with the functional necessity of having an effective defense against determined attackers.
So it's not necessarily about finding a single, perfect, ethical solution every single time, but rather about using this kind of structured framework to consciously strive for the most ethical solution possible within the practical constraints and risks of defending a real-world network.
That seems to be the most practical application, yes. It compels designers and operators to rigorously consider, document, and justify the ethical impact of their choices, rather than just focusing solely on technical effectiveness or legal permissibility. And importantly, the authors argue that this DCE framework, this way of thinking, has relevance far beyond just cyber deception.
Applying to other areas of technology ethics as well.
Yes. The ARST paper explicitly suggests it's applicable to other challenging tech ethics issues. For example, the ethical design of online recommendation systems, thinking about issues like filter bubbles, fairness, transparency, potential for manipulation.
Like YouTube algorithms, maybe.
Potentially, yes,
Yeah.
or the growing field of AI accountability. When an AI system causes harm, maybe a faulty medical diagnostic AI, or a biased hiring algorithm who is responsible. Did the designers and developers follow sound ethical principles like goodwill, no harm, transparency, and fairness in creating and deploying that AI system? The DCE framework could provide a lens for evaluating that.
That really broadens the scope significantly. It shows how these specific ethical questions we're grappling with in cyber deception are actually part of a much larger critical conversation about responsible technology design and deployment across the board.
Absolutely. It highlights the increasing importance of moving the conversation in technology development beyond purely technical capabilities and legal compliance to proactively include these deeper moral and ethical responsibilities that come with designing and deploying powerful systems that impact people's lives and security.
Okay, wow. We have covered a tremendous amount of ground here. We've gone from the origins of simple early honeypots, used mainly for research,
Right, the cheese for the mouse.
all the way to the advanced techniques and integrated frameworks of modern deception technology, the potential future role of highly sophisticated AI,
The autonomous deception designers.
the absolutely crucial legal pitfalls you need to avoid, with detailed checklists for due diligence.
Document, banner, consult, contain. Got it.
Okay.
And finally, wrestling with the complex ethical considerations required for designing and using these powerful systems responsibly, using frameworks like the doctrine of cyberattack. It's been quite a journey through the sources. We've definitely seen that deception, when implemented thoughtfully, is a really powerful tool. It gives you visibility you might not otherwise have. It helps reduce that critical attacker dwell time by catching them early. And it provides invaluable, highly specific threat intelligence about who is targeting you and how.
Offering unique advantages that traditional defenses alone often can't provide.
Exactly. And for organizations that are listening and thinking, okay, maybe we should explore adding this capability, figuring out the implementation options is a key first step. And as we mentioned, exploring resources like www.cisomarketplace.com can really help security leaders research the landscape, compare different vendor offerings, and understand the trade-offs in the deception technology space.
That resource definitely sounds essential for anyone seriously considering adding deception tools to their security stack. But, as you've made very clear throughout this discussion, it's absolutely not a silver bullet solution.
Not at all.
It requires significant technical planning and expertise, extremely careful implementation, especially that network separation and containment piece, and, perhaps most importantly, thorough legal review and deep ethical consideration before you deploy anything.
The technical side is challenging, definitely, but ensuring you deploy deception legally and ethically is paramount. It's essential for avoiding serious unintended consequences, maintaining trust with your users and stakeholders, and ensuring the whole effort is actually beneficial rather than creating new problems.
Which leaves us, and you the listener, with a final provocative thought to consider as we wrap up this deep dive. As these deception technologies, potentially supercharged by advanced AI, become increasingly sophisticated, capable of creating incredibly realistic digital illusions, how do organizations navigate that incredibly fine line? The line between effectively misleading motivated attackers on one hand and maintaining essential trust, transparency, and ethical conduct towards everyone else, their employees, their legitimate users, partners, the broader public on the other.
It's a critical question for the future, isn't it?
What does that future digital landscape really look like when misdirection and illusion become as central and commonplace in cyber defense as building stronger walls and better locks?
It's a profound question. The technological capability to deceive is advancing incredibly rapidly, but the legal frameworks, the ethical guidelines, and perhaps most importantly, the public understanding and acceptance of these techniques are still evolving, still trying to catch up. The choices we all make as designers, implementers, policymakers, and users about how we deploy these powerful tools will fundamentally shape the trust landscape of the digital world we all inhabit.
A lot to think about indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.